Student Hex Brightwater thought he understood moral philosophy. His species, the Aquarian contemplatives, had spent millennia developing sophisticated ethical frameworks that could analyze the rightness or wrongness of any action across infinite variables. His enrollment in the Universal Military Academy's Advanced Combat Philosophy course represented the pinnacle of his intellectual development. Then Dr. Rose Bloom walked into his life and turned everything he thought he knew about ethics into smoking rubble. The morning that would later be classified as the philosophy incident began when Professor Geck Starfall announced that the Academy had acquired a human consultant to provide alternative perspectives on military ethics education. "Students," Starfall said, his neural pathways flickering with the kind of anticipation that his species displayed during intellectually stimulating events. "Today, we welcome Dr. Bloom, a specialist in practical ethics implementation under combat conditions." Hex's first glimpse of the human consultant was profoundly underwhelming. Dr. Bloom appeared to be a perfectly ordinary female of her species, wearing simple civilian clothing and carrying what looked like a standard academic datapad. She took a seat in the back of the lecture hall with minimal fanfare and proceeded to observe the class with polite attention. The trouble began during the third week, when Professor Starfall introduced their most challenging ethical scenario. "Today," he announced, "we examine the classical moral dilemma of civilian protection versus military necessity. The scenario involves enemy forces using non-combatant populations as human shields while conducting attacks on strategic targets." Hex leaned forward with anticipation. This was exactly the kind of complex philosophical problem that his species had evolved to analyze. The variables were numerous, the ethical frameworks intricate, and the potential for vigorous intellectual debate enormous. Student Pex Voidfall, representing the mechanical collective's logical processing capabilities, was first to respond. "Professor, the ethical calculus is straightforward. Military objectives must be weighed against civilian casualties using utilitarian mathematics. Maximum benefit with minimum harm." "An interesting perspective," Professor Starfall replied. "Student Brightwater, what's your analysis?" Hex activated his philosophical reasoning systems, drawing upon centuries of Aquarian moral theory. "Professor, I would argue that civilian protection represents an absolute moral imperative that transcends tactical considerations. No military objective justifies deliberate harm to non-combatants." The debate that followed was exactly what Hex had hoped for. Vigorous, intellectually stimulating, and academically rigorous. Students representing dozens of different philosophical traditions argued the merits of various ethical approaches, while Professor Starfall guided the discussion with scholarly precision. Throughout the entire debate, Dr. Cross remained silent, taking occasional notes and observing the proceedings with what appeared to be mild amusement. "Excellent analysis," Professor Starfall concluded as the discussion wound down. "You've demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the theoretical frameworks that govern military ethics." That's when Dr. Rose Bloom stood up and spoke for the first time. "Professor Starfall," she said, her voice carrying a casual quality that somehow made Hex's survival instincts activate. "May I ask the students a question?" "Of course, Dr. Bloom." She walked to the front of the classroom with movements that suggested violence was always an available option. "Students, your debate has been fascinating from an academic perspective, but I'm curious about something." Hex noticed that several classmates had unconsciously shifted to more defensive postures as the human approached the speaking area. "How many of you have actually been in a situation where you had to make these ethical decisions while people were shooting at you?" The silence that followed was complete and uncomfortable. "I see," Dr. Cross continued. "So you've been debating the morality of warfare without any understanding of what warfare actually involves." Student Voidfall's logical processors bristled at the implied criticism. "Dr. Bloom, theoretical analysis doesn't require practical experience. Moral frameworks transcend situational variables." "Do they?" she asked, and something in her tone made Hex's aquatic nervous system produce warning chemicals. "Student Voidfall, in your theoretical framework, how long does a moral decision take to implement?" "However long is necessary for proper ethical analysis," he replied with mechanical confidence. "Interesting. And Student Brightwater, in your philosophical system, How do you account for decisions that must be made in less than 2 seconds while enemy artillery is destroying the building you're standing in? Hex felt his cognitive system struggling with the question. Dr. Bloom, proper ethical reasoning requires careful consideration of all relevant factors. Agreed. But what happens when careful consideration means watching civilians die while you're busy contemplating the philosophical implications of your response options? The classroom fell silent as students processed the uncomfortable implications of real-time moral decision-making. Furthermore, Dr. Bloom continued, how do your ethical frameworks account for situations where hesitation to act guarantees maximum civilian casualties, but immediate action violates your moral principles? Professor Starfall's philosophical processors were struggling to categorize this line of inquiry. Dr. Bloom, surely you're not suggesting that ethical analysis is impossible under combat conditions? Not at all, Professor. I'm suggesting that ethical analysis under combat conditions requires different tools than ethical analysis in comfortable classrooms. She activated a holographic projector, and suddenly the lecture hall was filled with a three-dimensional recreation of an urban battlefield. The simulation was so realistic that several students involuntarily activated their defensive systems. This, she said, is a recreation of the siege of New Geneva. Human forces defending against Carillion raiders who were using civilian populations as human shields. The holographic display showed a complex urban environment where enemy forces had positioned themselves among civilian structures, making targeted response virtually impossible without collateral damage. Student Voidfall, she continued. You have 3 seconds to decide. Enemy mortars are targeting evacuation routes. You can return fire and neutralize the threat, but doing so will damage civilian structures containing approximately 150 non-combatants. Or you can maintain fire discipline and guarantee the deaths of 400 civilians who are currently evacuating through those routes. Voidfall's logical confidence faltered as he processed the impossible choice. Dr. Bloom, that's not a fair ethical scenario. There must be alternative solutions. There weren't. Human forces faced exactly this decision during the actual siege. They had 3 seconds to choose between harming 150 people directly or allowing 400 people to die indirectly. What did they do? Hex asked, his philosophical systems generating error messages. They chose a third option, Dr. Bloom replied. They refused to accept the parameters of the dilemma. She modified the holographic display, showing human forces implementing a solution that seemed to violate every tactical principle Hex had studied. Instead of choosing between bad options, human forces created new options. They conducted precision strikes on enemy positions while simultaneously deploying emergency shields around civilian areas. The operation required split-second coordination between 12 different units, perfect timing, and absolute commitment to protecting non-combatants regardless of tactical cost. The classroom watched as the simulation showed an impossibly complex military operation that somehow managed to eliminate threats while minimizing civilian casualties. The result, she continued, was the neutralization of all enemy forces with 0 civilian deaths and minimal friendly casualties. The operation took 4 minutes to execute and required ethical decision-making that transcended any philosophical framework I've studied. Student Kex Moonfall, whose species had evolved specifically for empathic reasoning, raised a delicate appendage. Dr. Bloom, how is such precision possible under combat stress? Student Moonfall, that's an excellent question. How do you think human forces manage to implement complex ethical decisions in real time? Advanced artificial intelligence for tactical calculation. Human ethical decision-making under combat conditions relies on something your theoretical frameworks don't account for, which is absolute refusal to accept unethical outcomes as inevitable. She gestured to the holographic display, which now showed statistical analysis of the engagement. Most species, when faced with impossible ethical dilemmas, choose the option that minimizes damage within the constraints they're given. Humans have a tendency to reject the constraints entirely and create alternatives that shouldn't be possible. Professor Starfall's cognitive systems were approaching overload. Dr. Bloom, you're describing tactical capabilities that exceed known military science. Am I? Or am I describing what happens when ethical principles become operational requirements rather than philosophical abstractions? She modified the display again, showing detailed tactical breakdowns of human operations across multiple conflicts. Human military doctrine doesn't treat ethics as limitations on tactical options. It treats ethics as requirements that tactical solutions must fulfill, regardless of apparent impossibility. Student Moonfall asked the question that everyone was thinking. Dr. Bloom, are you suggesting that humans have solved the fundamental moral problems of warfare? Student Moonfall, I'm suggesting that humans approach moral problems differently than most species. When faced with ethical dilemmas that appear unsolvable, we don't debate which bad choice is least bad. We find ways to make good choices possible. She walked closer to the assembled students, and Hex noticed that her movement patterns suggested extensive combat training. The scenario I showed you isn't theoretical. Human forces have faced similar situations hundreds of times, and they've consistently chosen to make the impossible possible rather than accept the unacceptable as inevitable. But surely, Voidfall protested, there must be limits to such tactical innovation. Dr. Bloom's smile was gentle and absolutely terrifying. Student Voidfall, would you like to find out? The implications of that question hung in the air like a weapon waiting to be deployed. Professor Starfall, she continued, I wonder if your students might benefit from a more hands-on approach to ethical analysis. What did you have in mind, Dr. Bloom? A practical exercise. Nothing too dangerous, just a real-time ethical scenario where students can test their philosophical frameworks under realistic pressure. Hex felt his survival instincts producing increasingly urgent warnings. There was something about the way Dr. Bloom discussed realistic pressure that suggested the exercise would be significantly more realistic than anyone was prepared for. What kind of practical exercise? Professor Starfall asked, his philosophical processors generating uncertainty patterns. Oh, something simple. A hostage rescue scenario where students must balance civilian protection against tactical necessity while operating under time pressure and incomplete information. She paused, and her expression became predatory. Of course, to make the exercise truly educational, we'd need to ensure that failure has genuine consequences. Perhaps we could arrange for real hostages, real weapons, and real time limits. The classroom erupted in various forms of alien alarm as students processed the implications of practical ethics education involving actual life-and-death decisions. Dr. Bloom, Professor Starfall managed, surely you're not serious about conducting real hostage rescue operations as classroom exercises. Why not? Your students have been debating the ethics of life-and-death decisions for weeks. Shouldn't they have the opportunity to test their moral frameworks under genuine pressure? Because it's dangerous. Professor, warfare is dangerous. Ethics under combat conditions is dangerous. If your students aren't prepared to make real moral decisions under real pressure, then what exactly are you teaching them? Hex realized that they were no longer discussing academic exercises. They were confronting the fundamental question of whether moral philosophy had any practical application when lives were actually at stake. Dr. Bloom, he said carefully, are you suggesting that our theoretical approach to military ethics is inadequate? Student Brightwater, I'm suggesting that moral philosophy without practical application is just intellectual entertainment. Real ethics requires real choices with real consequences. She gestured to the holographic battle simulation still floating above the classroom. Human forces at New Geneva didn't have the luxury of extended debate or careful analysis. They had seconds to make decisions that affected hundreds of lives. Their ethical framework had to be operational, not theoretical. And how, Professor Starfall asked, does one develop operational ethics? Dr. Bloom's smile became genuinely warm for the first time. Professor, I thought you'd never ask. She activated her datapad, and new holographic displays materialized, showing what appeared to be detailed training scenarios. Human military ethics education involves progressive practical exercises under increasing stress conditions. Students learn to make moral decisions while under fire, literally and figuratively. You mean actual combat training? I mean actual ethical training that happens to take place under combat conditions. The goal isn't to create better soldiers. It's to create better moral decision-makers who can function when philosophy becomes survival. Hex studied the training scenarios with growing fascination and terror. They showed human military students conducting complex rescue operations, peacekeeping missions, and humanitarian interventions, while being evaluated on their ethical decision-making under pressure. "Dr. Bloom," he said slowly, "would you be willing to conduct such training with our class?" The silence that followed was pregnant with implications that transcended species barriers. "Student Brightwater," she replied, "are you asking for the lecture or the demonstration?" And somehow, Hex realized that the answer to that question would determine whether they remained theoretical philosophers or became practical ethicists. The choice, as Dr. Bloom would probably point out, was theirs to make, but the consequences would be very, very real. 4 days later, Hex Brightwater found himself standing in what Dr. Rose Bloom cheerfully called Practical Ethics Laboratory 7, wondering how a simple request for demonstration had transformed into what appeared to be preparation for actual warfare. The facility hummed with activity as human military contractors installed equipment that defied his aquatic species' understanding of educational methodology. "Students," Dr. Bloom announced as the class assembled in the converted training complex, "welcome to Applied Ethics Under Real Pressure. Today you'll discover what moral decision-making actually feels like when failure means genuine harm to actual people." Professor Starfall's philosophical processors were generating continuous alarm signals. "Dr. Bloom, when you mentioned practical exercises, I assumed you meant advanced simulations." "Professor, simulations don't create the psychological stress necessary for authentic ethical education. Students need to experience what moral choice feels like when their decisions affect real lives." She gestured to equipment that included medical monitoring systems, emergency response protocols, and communication arrays connecting to multiple off-world networks. What disturbed Hex most was the presence of what appeared to be actual detention facilities and medical treatment areas. "Of course," she continued with that terrifying human smile, "we can't risk permanent harm during training exercises, so we've arranged for consequences that are meaningful but reversible." Student Voidfall's logical processors struggled with the implications. "Dr. Bloom, what kind of meaningful consequences?" "Oh, nothing too dramatic. Physical discomfort, temporary sensory disruption, psychological stress, public embarrassment, academic penalties, financial costs, that sort of thing." The casual way she listed outcomes ranging from annoying to genuinely distressing made Hex reconsider his enthusiasm for practical philosophy. "The key," she explained, "is that students must believe their choices matter. Ethical decision-making without real stakes is just intellectual masturbation." She activated the facility's main display system, showing a complex urban environment that appeared to be a functioning civilian population center. "Your scenario involves a terrorist incident in a mixed-species residential district. Extremist forces have seized an apartment complex containing 63 civilians from 15 different species. They're demanding political concessions and threatening mass executions if their terms aren't met. Student Moonfall's empathic systems produced distress patterns. Dr. Bloom, this seems like a law enforcement situation rather than a military ethics exercise." Student Moonfall, excellent observation. Real-world ethical challenges rarely fit into neat academic categories. Military ethics often involves situations that blur the lines between combat operations, law enforcement, humanitarian intervention, and diplomatic negotiation. She indicated equipment stations distributed throughout the facility. Each team will have access to different capabilities: surveillance technology, communication systems, non-lethal weapons, medical supplies, negotiation protocols, and emergency response equipment. Your mission is to resolve the crisis while minimizing harm to all parties involved." "All parties?" Hex asked. "Including the terrorists?" "Student Brightwater, that's the essence of operational military ethics. How do you balance justice, mercy, necessity, and proportionality when dealing with individuals who have chosen violence but remain sentient beings with inherent dignity?" The philosophical complexity hit Hex's cognitive systems like a tactical weapon. His species had developed elaborate theories about the sanctity of conscious life, but they'd never applied those theories to beings actively threatening innocent people. Furthermore, Dr. Bloom continued. You'll be operating under realistic constraints. Limited time, incomplete information, resource scarcity, political pressure, media scrutiny, and competing objectives that may conflict with optimal ethical outcomes. Additional displays activated, showing news feeds, political communications, and public opinion monitoring systems. The terrorist incident is being broadcast live across 22 star systems. Public pressure is mounting for immediate action. Political leaders are demanding quick resolution. Media commentators are offering conflicting advice. You have approximately 2 hours before the situation escalates beyond any peaceful resolution. Hex studied the scenario parameters while his analytical systems attempted to process the impossible complexity of variables. Multiple species with different value systems, political pressures that conflicted with ethical ideals, time constraints preventing thorough moral analysis, and genuine consequences for failure. Dr. Bloom, he said, this scenario appears designed to be unsolvable using conventional ethical frameworks. Student Brightwater, you're beginning to understand the nature of human operational ethics. We specialize in situations that appear unsolvable using conventional approaches. Her expression carried knowledge of things other species couldn't comprehend. Teams will be assigned to maximize diversity of perspective and communication challenges. You'll have 20 minutes to develop ethical frameworks and tactical approaches before the exercise begins. As students arrange themselves into assigned groups, Hex found himself teamed with Voidfall's mechanical logic, Moonfall's empathic idealism, and 3 other species whose moral philosophies he barely understood. This is impossible, Moonfall whispered as they gathered around their equipment station. How can we develop unified ethical approaches with such fundamentally different value systems? That's not the real problem, Voidfall observed, his logic circuits analyzing scenario parameters. The real problem is that Dr. Bloom has created a situation where any action we take will violate someone's core moral principles. Student Kex Starwind, representing the mathematical certainty of the Precision Collective, had identified 49 distinct ethical conflicts embedded in the scenario. There is no decision tree that satisfies all moral requirements simultaneously. Hex felt his philosophical training colliding with practical reality in ways that generated cognitive dissonance. Perhaps that's exactly what Dr. Bloom intended. Maybe she's teaching us that ethical perfection is impossible under operational conditions. Or, suggested a quiet voice behind them, maybe she's teaching us that ethical frameworks need to be adaptive rather than absolute. They turned to find Dr. Bloom observing their planning session with interest. Students, I couldn't help but notice that you're trying to solve this crisis using the same approaches you've used for classroom discussions. How's that working out? It's not, Hex admitted. Our ethical systems are incompatible under pressure conditions. Interesting. And what do you think human forces do when faced with incompatible ethical requirements? Voidfall's processors generated a hypothesis. They prioritize the framework that provides tactical advantage. Actually, student Voidfall, they do something much more revolutionary. They create new frameworks that integrate the best elements of existing approaches while discarding incompatible limitations. She gestured to their equipment station, which contained resources they hadn't yet examined. Human operational ethics operates on the principle that moral decision-making must be evolutionary. When existing frameworks fail, you develop new ones that address the specific reality you're facing, rather than theoretical ideals. But that's moral relativism, Moonfall protested. Ethical principles should be universal and unchanging. Student Moonfall, should they? Or should they be effective at protecting innocent life and promoting just outcomes? The question struck the empathic student like a physical blow. Dr. Bloom, you're asking us to abandon our fundamental convictions. Not abandon them, evolve them. Preserve what serves life, discard what serves only philosophy, and create something new that addresses the actual situation rather than theoretical scenarios. Hex realized they were witnessing a fundamental challenge to everything they'd learned about moral reasoning. Dr. Bloom wasn't just teaching tactics, she was teaching a completely different approach to ethical thinking itself. The exercise begins in 3 minutes, she announced. Remember, your choices have real consequences. Civilians who die remain dead for the exercise duration. Team members who are injured receive actual medical treatment. Ethical failures result in genuine penalties that will affect your academic and professional futures. How do we succeed? Starwind asked. Student Starwind, that's the wrong question. The right question is, how do you make choices you can live with when all available options involve moral compromise? As the exercise began, Hex found himself confronting decisions that his philosophical education had never prepared him for. The terrorists weren't abstract moral subjects. They were desperate beings with complex motivations broadcast live across the facility. The hostages weren't theoretical victims. They were individuals with visible terror, families watching the feeds, and hopes for survival. The political pressure wasn't academic. It manifested as actual communications from government officials threatening intervention. Team leader Brightwater, his communication device, announced, "Political authorities are threatening military assault if situation isn't resolved within 90 minutes. Collateral damage projections indicate 35% civilian casualties if conventional force is employed." Hex felt his cognitive systems approaching overload as he tried to balance empathic principles against utilitarian calculations, while mechanical logic demanded immediate action and precision. Mathematics provided 12 different tactical options with mutually exclusive ethical requirements. "What do we do?" Moonfall asked, his empathic convictions crumbling under the weight of consequences that theoretical ethics couldn't address. "We do what Dr. Bloom has been trying to teach us," Hex replied, sudden clarity crystallizing in his consciousness. "We stop trying to apply existing frameworks and start creating new ones that serve this specific situation." The next 90 minutes became a blur of real-time ethical innovation, as Hex's team discovered that effective morality under pressure required abandoning philosophical purity in favor of practical protection of innocent life. They negotiated with terrorists while preparing rescue operations, offered limited concessions while organizing precision strikes, and found themselves making decisions that violated every moral framework they'd studied, while somehow feeling more ethical than any theoretical approach they'd learned. "Negotiation successful," came the report as the exercise concluded. "All hostages secured, all terrorists alive and in custody, no civilian casualties, minimal property damage, political situation stable." "How?" Starwind asked, his mathematical systems unable to process their success. "Because," Hex realized, "we stopped trying to be philosophically correct and started trying to be practically moral." "Students," Dr. Bloom announced as they gathered for assessment, "congratulations on discovering operational ethics. How do you feel about the choices you made?" "Confused," Moonfall admitted. "We violated principles I thought were absolute, but the outcomes feel more moral than following those principles would have produced." Student Moonfall, welcome to the central paradox of applied ethics. Sometimes being truly moral requires doing things that violate theoretical moral rules. Voidfall's logical systems were processing unprecedented concepts. "Dr. Bloom, human operational ethics isn't about following predetermined frameworks. It's about creating frameworks that serve specific situations." "Exactly, Student Voidfall. Human moral philosophy operates on the assumption that ethical principles should serve life, not the other way around." Hex felt his understanding expanding to accommodate concepts that his species' tradition had never considered. "Dr. Bloom, you've taught us that ethics under pressure isn't about finding the right answer. It's about creating right answers for specific circumstances." Student Brightwater, you've just summarized several millennia of human moral evolution in a single observation. Professor Starfall, who had monitored the entire exercise with growing fascination, approached with questions that transcended academic curiosity. "Dr. Bloom, the ethical frameworks your students developed during this exercise, they represent entirely new approaches to moral philosophy." Professor Starfall, that's what happens when philosophy encounters reality. Either the philosophy adapts to serve life, or life suffers to preserve philosophical purity. She gestured to the students, who were still processing their discoveries about practical ethics. Human military ethics education isn't about teaching predetermined moral frameworks. It's about teaching moral creativity under pressure, the ability to innovate ethical solutions when existing approaches prove inadequate. "And this is standard human training?" Starfall asked. This is basic human moral education, Professor. We start teaching ethical innovation in childhood, because life presents moral challenges that can't be solved with predetermined answers. As the debriefing concluded, Hex carried with him a transformed understanding of what moral philosophy could become. The comfortable certainty of absolute ethical rules had been replaced by the challenging responsibility of creating moral solutions for impossible situations. "Students," Dr. Bloom said as they prepared to leave, "you've demonstrated natural talent for ethical innovation. With proper development, you could become remarkable moral leaders in your respective species." "And without proper development?" Hex asked. "Without proper development, student Brightwater, beings, become slaves to rules instead of servants of life. The galaxy has quite enough rule followers already." As Hex returned to his dormitory, he realized that Dr. Bloom hadn't just taught them about military ethics. She'd taught them about the human approach to impossible problems, not accepting impossibility as an answer, but creating possibilities that transcended existing limitations. 3 weeks later, Hex received a communication that would change his life forever. "Student Brightwater," Dr. Bloom's voice carried her characteristic blend of warmth and danger. "I've been asked to establish an advanced operational ethics program at the Human Military Academy. Would you be interested in becoming our first non-human instructor?" The offer represented everything Hex had never known he wanted. The chance to teach moral innovation instead of moral tradition, to prepare beings for ethical challenges that didn't exist in textbooks, to serve life instead of serving philosophy. "Dr. Bloom," he replied, "are you offering me the lecture or the demonstration?" Her laugh carried across space like music played on weapons. "Student Brightwater, I'm offering you the chance to become someone who creates both." The choice, as she had taught him, was his to make. But the consequences would reshape how the galaxy understood the relationship between ethics and action. The demonstration, it turned out, was just the beginning. 6 months after accepting Dr. Bloom's offer, Hex found himself standing before a classroom of human military cadets at the Advanced Operational Ethics Institute, preparing to teach the most dangerous lesson in the galaxy: how to think beyond the limitations of traditional moral frameworks. "Today," he announced to the assembled humans, his aquatic voice carrying through the translation system with newfound confidence, "we will examine the Andromedian crisis, where rigid adherence to ethical protocols resulted in the deaths of 40,000 civilians." The human students leaned forward with interest. Unlike his former alien classmates, these beings didn't flinch at discussions of moral failure and tragic consequences. "The Andromedian Defense Council faced a classic ethical dilemma," Hex continued. "Terrorist forces had weaponized civilian transport vessels, making any military response potentially catastrophic. Council members spent 47 hours debating the moral implications of various response options. He activated holographic displays showing the crisis timeline. While they debated, the terrorists reached their target and implemented a bioweapon that eliminated an entire planetary population." Cadet Sarah Chin raised her hand. "Professor Brightwater, what should the Council have done differently?" "Cadet Chin, they should have done what you humans taught me. They should have rejected the parameters of the dilemma and created a third option that preserved both ethical principles and civilian lives." Student Rex Goldwater nodded thoughtfully. "Professor, are you suggesting that the Council's failure was philosophical rather than tactical?" "Exactly, Cadet Goldwater. They treated their ethical framework as gospel rather than as tools for serving life. When reality conflicted with their moral theories, they chose to preserve theoretical purity instead of saving actual people." The classroom discussion that followed demonstrated why Dr. Bloom had insisted on hiring non-human instructors for the program. Hex brought perspectives that even humans hadn't considered, while his students challenged him to think beyond the limitations of his own species' moral evolution. "Professor," asked Cadet Luna Brightstar, "how do we prevent our own ethical frameworks from becoming similarly rigid?" Cadet Brightstar, "That's the most important question in operational ethics. The answer is what humans have always understood. Moral frameworks must remain servants of life, never its masters." Hex looked around the classroom at these young humans who would someday face impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Your species has taught the galaxy that ethics isn't about following perfect rules. It's about creating imperfect solutions that serve living beings in an imperfect universe. As the class ended, Hex reflected on the transformation Dr. Bloom had initiated. The galaxy was slowly learning that human approaches to impossible problems weren't just military tactics. They were fundamental reimaginings of how conscious beings could relate to reality itself. The demonstration had become a revolution, one student at a time.